Hello, you're watching a special edition of CNBC Africa where we are dissecting the budget that's been presented in Parliament by the Finance Minister of South Africa, Enoch Godongwana. If you watched us in Power Lunch, I had Cobus Potgieter, portfolio manager. I asked him, what are you trading today? He said, Godfrey, I am going for the banks. So guess who is at the top of the leaderboard? It's First Rand, 4.1%, 91 up 3.5%, and also Coronation Fund Managers up 2.9%. In part, it tells you who is one of the winners. What has the Rand done? The first indicator of whether the markets like this budget or not, the Rand is still strong, 18.05 against the US dollar. Annabel Bishop is a chief economist at Investex. She's joining us for this discussion. Professor David Warneke, chair of SAICA's National Tax Committee, is joining us as well. As I said later, Peter Atad-Montalto, head of capital markets Intellidex, is going to be joining the conversation. Annabel, I was going to begin with you and ask if the overrun that you had budgeted was in line with what the minister announced. Welcome.
Hi, Godfrey. Yes, you know, the actual, very importantly, the gross loan debt forecasts were in line with what our forecast, and you know that is for the medium term being around 70% of GDP. So I think, you know, the financial markets did like this budget as far as it's been reflected in the Rand. We saw it moving to 17.96 to the US dollar, so a bit of strength there. I think that's some good news because we've seen obviously a very weak currency.
Yeah.
Coming through in the last several months. Bear in mind, however, that the backdrop is one of extreme global risk aversion, and as a consequence, we would not expect too much positive impact on financial markets here in South Africa from the budget, even though it is a good budget. The one thing I would say to you is while the debt levels, the percentage peaks sooner than expected, and in fact peaks at a lower percentage of GDP. And while there's been some actual cut-off of debt itself in terms of borrowing projections over the medium term, and in fact the fiscal deficit as well drops down to 3%. So again, all in line with attempting fiscal consolidation. The point really here, however, is that for South Africa to see a sustainable government set of finances, the debt levels are seen to be closer to about 60%, although the fiscal deficit of about 3% sounds right. So from that perspective, we're moving into the right direction, but we're not there yet. And I think, you know, that's really what the minister tried to convey today as well, that, you know, we're in a difficult environment. It could get worse globally. One last point I want to make, Godfrey, is I think, you know, you and I talked earlier in the week and we were saying that the high inflation rate would deflate the fiscal ratios. And that's exactly what's happened. You know, when you have a high inflation rate, your nominal GDP comes out significantly higher, which is what we've seen. In other words, your debt and your deficit as a percent of GDP come out low. And that certainly had an impact on our fiscal ratios today.
Yeah, so you used a word that I was going to ask you to use to try to characterize the budget, i.e. was this a good budget? And I think you used the word, but I wanted to ask if you would go so far as to say that the minister has absolutely done the best that he could in the circumstances.
I think it's an okay budget. I think it might be a bit of a stretch to say it's a good budget. I think, you know, it's difficult given the current environment that we're in, that there's a risk of obviously substantial slower economic growth next year. In fact, even risk of a global recession. We've seen on Bloomberg's investors are factoring in, you know, 100% chance. And of course, that really speaks to this risk aversion I'm talking about in financial markets. And I've run through all the fiscal ratios, but I think, you know, he has done well with what he's got, you know, with the revenue overrun and with the expenditure. It's a difficult environment. You can't really say we can't give bailouts to Eskom or Transnet, given that they are so key for economic growth in South Africa. But I like the caveats he's put in place, and that there needs to be extreme caution in taking Eskom's debt onto the balance sheet, even if it's 1 to 2/3 of the 400 billion, to make sure that the entity doesn't become over-indebted again, that it's unable to service the debt, because government cannot rescue Eskom likely a second time. It's going to put strain on our government finances. Yes, the credit rating agencies do include Eskom in our government debt calculation. We think the budget is probably credit neutral to maybe slightly positive. I think it's just a bit hard, you know, because we don't know exactly how severe the global economic slowdown will be. It is expected to be centered more on advanced economies than obviously emerging markets, but we couldn't expect to see South Africa escape unscathed.
Yeah. I can see you smiling, Annabel. I can see you smiling. Peter joins us now. Peter, I wanted to ask as well right at the outset whether you are happy and whether you would use a single word like good, bad, not good, 2 words, to describe the budget that's just been presented.
Hi, great to be back with you. I think this is a great starting point to see fiscal slippage from, and I think that's the way to put it. There are huge execution risks here. There are huge revenue risks, but we have pretty decent buffers coming in. We have 41 to 47 billion of unallocated reserves in the outer 2 fiscal years. We have some decent buffers in the next fiscal year as well. So overall, I think it's, as I said, if we're going to have execution risk, this is the place to start from. The budget's probably going to appear a little worse than this, but we are in, I think, a meaningfully different fiscal place than we were thinking we would be, even in 2019, to be honest, even pre-COVID. And so whilst we may not get back this 1.5% primary surplus, I think politically it's going to be very challenging. Yeah. Even if we're coming in at a shallower profile, this is still going to be a more positive dynamic, certainly. The big surprise today, I think, is what they're penciling in terms of issuance. They can actually cut SAGB issuance next year, and that's quite a shock to, I think, local bond managers who were sort of expecting, I think consensus was, an increase next year. So there is the possibility of doing that. Treasury might not take all of that space that exists. They may well remain quite risk averse. But again, this is looking much more positive than the budget back in February, when the implied levels of SAGB issuance were actually a lot higher than they're coming now in TBPS. So sorry, back to one word. Yeah. I would say yes.
Okay, all right. But another question that will obviously come into play. I remember we had this discussion, I think it was not Minister Godongwana, I think it was the minister before that, and we were talking about the fact that the markets obviously have to believe the numbers. I wanted one more point around that. Are the numbers credible, believable?
So yes, within reason, right? And I said there's going to be some slippage, and if we expect that, yes, then actually, we manage our expectations, and they're okay. Our revenue numbers are roughly the same. Interestingly, we actually have a VAT hike in our own forecast, which they don't talk about at MTBPS. I think they will actually end up having to do some, or try and do some kind of tax hike in the new year, and maybe implicit in some of these numbers. And we have to see how they allocate some of these unallocated reserves and where the political pressures around that are. I think it was a little bit of a mistake today not to make SRD permanent. It's only a 1-year extension. I think that's kind of sort of odd games, if you like, given given the underlying political dynamic around that. But no, the numbers I think are roughly okay versus our own forecasts.
Yeah, I'm going to use a word to describe the minister as well as the governor of the Reserve Bank, and suggest that South Africa has got two conservative officials in charge of the South African Reserve Bank and the South African National Treasury. If anyone disagrees with me, let's see if we can take up that argument. David, can I come to you? I wanted your overall initial impressions on that budget, and if there were any surprises, like Peter mentions, no VAT discussed, and also there's the issue of no general tax increases, as it were.
Yeah, Godfrey, hi, and yeah, look, this isn't the occasion where major tax policy changes are announced, so that was no real surprise to me that there weren't any in there.
Okay.
In line, I think, pretty much with what was expected widely. I think the gross revenue overrun of about 83 billion rand was sort of in line with expectations. It does mean that tax to GDP ratio of 25% is going to be pretty high, is very high by comparative standards. What was quite pleasing to me was the mention of the cases that have led to 4.8 billion of tax collections resulting from the state capture inquiry, with 222 cases. I thought that was quite good progress, although we've, I think, been collectively frustrated in South Africa at the relatively slow progress of that, but it's good to see that the wheels are turning. I was quite pleased to, or maybe sort of surprised, pleased to see talk of efficiencies at SARS that could possibly lead to a permanent increase in revenue. What I was hoping might be announced here is an update on where they are with the discussion document that was going to be released. It was announced in February 21's budget, to do with governance at SARS, because while we are seeing that they are efficient at collecting tax, there certainly are issues around dispute resolution with SARS, accountability and so forth for decisions that are made. And so I think that document is long overdue. But to come back to the starting point, I think it was largely in line with what I had expected, yes.
So that would suggest that if I were to ask you to use one word to describe the budget, you would say it was a good budget. I'm going to add another question on top of that. Let me just quickly give you another question on top of that. I wanted your thoughts in terms of the strength of the collections on both the corporate as well as personal income sides.
Yeah, Godfrey, the first point, I think I would describe it as fairly good, I suppose, from a tax point, just looking at it from income, from a tax point of view overall, because I think that if there had been announcements of increases in corporate rates or increases in taxes overall, I think that would have been very negative. I don't think that we can, we in the space for increases at the moment. I think, if anything, one could look at reducing the corporate tax rate, maybe an increase in the VAT rate, possibly one could argue for, I suppose.
Yeah.
But that, of course, we know is a hot potato. But, with regard to the strength of the recovery, yes, I think with the higher commodity prices still continuing, that's not really a surprise that the corporate income tax collections have been good. And then it was mentioned that there's an overall recovery as well. I suppose post-COVID one would have expected that. Individuals did maybe surprise me slightly that there has been quite a strong collection from them, but it's not nearly as high as the corporate collections and the import duties, which I suppose are also not really a surprise on the collection of imported products.
Yeah, and I suppose also we have to factor in inflation, as Annabelle was saying. Let me come to you, Annabelle, and ask maybe a difficult question. What is the difference between holding debt inside the name of Eskom and taking it onto the national treasury? Because as the minister says, they're going to take between 1/3 and 2/3. Could he have taken the whole thing anyway and gotten done and dusted with it?
So from the credit rating agencies, they say there's not much difference. They assess South Africa's state debt as essentially including the debted guarantees. And that, of course, in bulk is Eskom's debt out of those guarantees. The key point, I think, is that government is probably quite wary of taking on Eskom's debt. Taking on 1 to 2/3 instead of the entire amount. I think there's concern that taking on the entire amount possibly gives Eskom free rein to rack up its borrowings again and could run into financial issues that might not be able to generate the revenue that it hopes and might not be able to service the debt. I think those are valid concerns, from government. The key point really is that whether it takes on 1/3 or 2/3, obviously that will then swell its debt ratios and reduce some of this fiscal consolidation. The point really is that possibly it's a good time to think of doing it, and which is what the minister said today, and to start doing it, which is not what he did today. And the point really is that, we need to find ourselves in a situation where some rescue plan actually does come through from Eskom. I mean, having a look at what the minister actually said, and I'm just going to, find the point that he mentioned, was that he said that National Treasury is leading a process to finalize the debt relief program designed to restore Eskom to efficiency and financial sustainability. And that's very important as well. Fiscal to restore it to efficiency and financial sustainability. So it's not just about taking the debt onto government's balance sheet and giving Eskom free rein to do what it would after that. It's also you're looking at the selection of the relevant debt instruments, method of effecting the relief. It's still being finalized. I think National Treasury is being very careful. I think they really want to give a very strong message to Eskom that they need to be cautious in terms of borrowing. slowing. And, yes, they could obviously have wholesale taken it on, but of course that would have had some negative market impact. I think the slow process that they're doing is probably the right one, but I do think that there are probably other mechanisms. The bottom line essentially is that South Africa's state debt itself is still, very high. We're looking at the debt escalating. I think I had the figure just now to 5.4 trillion by 2024-25. Obviously, the concern there is that it's double what it was in 2018-19 at 2.8 trillion. So we haven't really eroded the effect of the pandemic. And of course, the point is that now we're looking to load more debt on. Everything, might be manageable if we don't run into another crisis. We're not essentially out of the woods here, Godfrey.
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. And you're building up my case, by the way, and we're going to come back to my case and talk about it. Peter, does it matter? 1/3, 2/3, the whole hog? And in addition to that, does that change the dynamic in terms of South Africa's credit rating with the rating agencies?
So there's been a very bizarre split on this issue since 2019 between local investors and foreign investors. Foreign investors are far more used to dealing with these sorts of credit workout situations than local investors. We saw this with the massive pickle that Land Bank has gotten into on their debt restructuring with local investors. But we should remember that the Eskom debt plan was largely written in 2019. Nothing basically has changed since then. We've had all these crazy ideas coming out from a variety of locals on debt for equity swaps, on structured equity solutions, etc., none of which were ever going to happen. GIPF involvement, all these sorts of things, which were never going to happen. This has always been about a switch auction process, a voluntary switch auction process, where people would get SAGBs in return for Eskom debt, not a change of obligor, not a restructuring, not a haircut. And so we are finally getting to that position. Treasury has brought on board expertise. We're going to, I think, see them talking a lot more openly now in public, as well as in private with bondholders, on these things now in the run-up to the budget, ready for execution in the new fiscal year. But as Annabelle says, this doesn't solve, it's not the be-all and end-all of solving Eskom. This is one small component that you have to make sure, particularly a future Eskom CEO. You haven't had me on the program since I started saying, Godfrey, that I see Andre probably exiting before the end of the fiscal year. You have to lock in the future leadership of Eskom to make sure that they don't go crazy with a delevered balance sheet.
Yeah, I would have teft him out if I had been allowed to do so. But I wanted to be clear, Peter, there's been no talk of a haircut here. There's likely to be no haircut for creditors, local,
there will be
international.
No haircut. There will be absolutely no haircut. Now there's a really interesting question that one can have over a cocktail about should there be, and should hedge funds who made a lot of money out of it get haircuts. But the government is so risk averse on this, they are not going to do anything around haircuts. This is a NPV neutral switch that's going to happen for people. People are not going to make losses out of this process.
Sure. The whole stance around SOE reform, does it allay any of the fears in the markets about the government potentially losing this battle, given the struggles that we have seen around Transnet and also, of course, the other parastatals we just talked about, the Land Bank?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think Treasury's stance is exceptionally clear here of the need of conditionality on all SOEs, and they will be bringing that forward, I think, and describing this in quite a lot of detail. We'll be seeing as they're quizzed on this in Parliament and in public and with investors on the roadshow. This will all start coming out, I'm sure. Now, of course, Treasury is just one half of this. There is DPE. There are the other entities as well. Eskom has been given its leadership very open to this sort of discussion. Transnet, I think, is going to be more of a battle. We've seen that around what's happened around 30-party rail access and some of the complications of doing some of the reforms overall. So I think the proof is going to be in the pudding very much on Transnet. The Treasury line here is very, very clear.
Yeah. David, did Godongwana miss a trick in solving the BIG problem? Could he have done it under the framework of trying to address a very, very high inflation rate in an environment globally where people sort of understand government interventionist measures to try to cushion the poor from the high inflation we see?
Godfrey, I doubt it. I mean, I think it was maybe a sensible approach to just push it out for another year. And then to say that anything further than that must be sort of revenue neutral in a way, I think that's probably right. I don't think South Africa, as sad as it is, can afford to be a welfare state in any way at all. Without the growth that we would so much long for, I really don't think that there was another way of boosting any of those grants. Unfortunately, what we really need is to have expenditure that actually boosts economic growth and go for the longer term. Poverty relief in that fashion.
Yeah, I was going to ask quickly if you like Godongwane, given the fact that what we're seeing here is restrained in an environment where you could have done things that generally the markets and I think business people would have understood, but he hasn't.
Yeah, I'm not too sure that there was really much else that could have been done in that regard.
Okay, all right. One final thought with you. Corruption, the anti-corruption fight. There's a couple of pages that have been devoted to what the government is doing around that. Are you convinced that this could be a line in the sand that perhaps helps South Africa transition into a new environment where, as you spoke about, the strength of the constitution and democracy and the need for accountability, that we could finally be seeing here people being brought to book for their sins?
Godfrey, I really hope that is the case. I mean, these 222 cases sound impressive, but really I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. There's state capture went so deep and so on that it's a mammoth undertaking to try and bring all of those criminals to justice, unfortunately. But certainly this is a move in the right direction. Whether or not it will play a major part in us being able to avoid grey listing is, I suppose, doubtful, sadly.
Yeah.
But it certainly does indicate that we're on the right path, even if it's still quite limited.
The right path. Annabelle, I was saying you were building up my case on the character of the minister here, and in parting, I wanted to ask if Godongwane 2.0 is a minister that you believe South Africa needs at this particular juncture and is perhaps doing a good job in the circumstances. Peter, the same question is coming to you.
Yes, I do actually, Godfrey. I've actually been very pleased by his performance so far. I think he's done really well. One of the things he's done, he's done many things, but one of the things he's done is to hold a hard line on excessive salary and wage increases. We'll see how well he does with the 3% for the public sector. That's quite low given that inflation is around 7.5% in South Africa. So at the moment, obviously, it's expected to come down and drop back down towards the midpoint next year. So I think he's got a lot of strong goals. I think fiscal consolidation goals. I think he's sticking to them. He's actually delivering in some areas. He has obviously not been handed an easy environment to run public finances in. But my quick summary, which I'm sure you want quick, is that he's doing quite well given the circumstances.
Yeah, Peter, you warming up to him or not?
Well, I think the ultimate sort of test of a Minister of Finance is what do they do with their staff, right? And I think what we've really seen in this case is that we often exaggerate how strong Treasury is. I know we've talked about that a lot in the past, but really the best people in Treasury, I think, have been very strongly supported by the minister. And that's what you're seeing coming out here from various different areas, whether that's SOEs, asset liability management, whether that's the budget office, etc., or economic policy. That I think is the minister's sort of secret sauce, and what we haven't actually seen with some of his predecessors. So for me, that is really the test which he passes.
Yeah, he passes. He says, I'm going to take that, and I think it's something that I agree with. And so I think my characterization, lady and gentlemen, is correct. We have a conservative finance minister, or a conservative finance minister in the making. We have a conservative governor of the South African Central Bank, and I think in this environment, that's a good thing. Let me thank my panelists today. Annabel Bishop, Chief Economist at Investec. Thank you again for your time, Annabel. We appreciate it. Peter Atad Montalto, Intellidex. Thank you, sir, for taking time to chat to us in Southern Africa. Professor David Warneke, Chair of SAICA's National Tax Committee. Thank you all for your time and your insights. The rand, I can tell you now, hasn't gone anywhere. 1805, 1807 is what we're talking about. And the rand, of course, is the first barometer of investors' assessment of this budget. We're done for now. Thank you. In a few minutes, we're going to go to our closing bell, West Africa.